All right, welcome to this webinar revisiting the internal market for academic perspectives on the Letta and Draghi report from different fields of EU law. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event of the University of Groningen, the Faculty of Law. My name is Willem Janssen. I'm an endowed professor of public procurement law at the faculty, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session. Now, before we get started, as noted, we're recording this webinar. During the webinar, please turn off your sound and keep your camera off. And should you have questions, feel free to post them throughout the webinar in the chat box. Now, it's an absolute pleasure, like I said, to welcome you all here because we have a stellar lineup of esteemed colleagues here today. I'll run you through the program briefly, and then, of course, I'll give them the floor. We start off with an external relations perspective from Professor Dr. Ramses Wessel, Professor of European Law. Then we move to energy law by Dr. Lea Diestelmeier, an assistant professor of, amongst other things, in energy law. That's the first block, right? And I hope that you'll pose your questions in the chat box throughout their presentations, because that will make my job a bit easier, as I will be able to gather those questions and pose them to our speakers. Then we'll have a short break, perhaps get a cup of coffee then, and we'll move to our second 1-hour block, in which we'll move to the consumer law perspective by Professor Dr. Charlotte Pavillon, a professor of private law, predominantly consumer law. And then we'll close off with a competition or economic law perspective by Professor Dr. Hans Vedder, a professor of economic law at the faculty. And again, system is the same. We'll have some time for questions. And hopefully, by the end of it, in those 2 hours, you will be fully in the know of the two reports, the Letta and the Draghi reports, and you'll be able to at least get some feelers of how to assess them in light of these perspectives. And again, leave your questions in the chat box and keep your sound and camera off. And of course, as a teaser as well, if you haven't had enough of this topic following this webinar, please note already that we'll publish a series of blogs on the European Law blog, probably starting for February next year. So feel free to look out for those as well. So what was the starting point, or what brought us all together? It's these two seemingly already milestone reports by Letta and by Draghi. And the starting point and the focus of this webinar today is to assess them and basically the question how they will change the internal market, perhaps the European Union or the European cooperation, and EU law as a consequence. We'll focus on two things, and of course the speakers are free and have been free to assess that in their own way, but we'll at least try to get an initial understanding of the impact of these reports on the functioning of these fields of EU law. And we would like to take the next step is also discuss them and to consider what are potential future negative and positive effects of these reports written this year. And before I pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Wessel, just to put them in a bit of context, the Letta report was published in April this year, much more than a market, and the Draghi report came a bit later, even though anticipated before the summer, it came after the future of European competitiveness. And I think what's important to stress here, and I think you'll also find that in the analysis of the different speakers, is that they're also very much influenced by the current context in which the European Union operates. They are seen as an answer to that context. And I think I'd like to highlight just a few because I think they will return in the analysis as well. I think a predominant part here is the changed political landscape, which perhaps says something also about the feasibility of many of the proposals that are posed since the elections in June, which as a consequence also led to the formation of the second von der Leyen Commission and the published political guidelines, which came in between these, the publication of these reports. And of course, in the backdrop of it, it's a response to continued global conflicts. Of course, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia still plays a big part of it, but also the conflict between Israel and Palestine plays a part here. And as a consequence, also, we've entered strategic autonomy discussions more than ever. supply chains are being discussed from a security perspective. And of course, as a lingering aspect in the background is how we move Europe towards a more green and social society in light of, say, climate change and social injustice. Now, more recently, we've seen a response to this report already, which will briefly be touched upon by some of our speakers. The Council response to these Letta and Draghi reports. Now, of course, perhaps I was being a bit too ambitious by noting that they're milestone reports already, but let's see what our speakers have to say about that. If I can move on to the first speaker of today, who will share his brief reflections, and then, of course, he'll be available to answer the questions that you might have. Can I give you the floor, Ramses?
Thanks very much, Willem. Indeed, it's also nice to be the very first speaker in this nice webinar. Although it's a bit strange, perhaps, to start with external relations. Normally, we would start with the internal, and then add the external. Right? We're now going outside in a way, and there's actually a reason for that, as you will see in my next slide. There is basically it is about what Willem also already announced as the changing landscape. So basically, if you look at both reports, and that is actually what I would like to do the coming, let's say, 15 minutes or so, guide you a bit through my first observations of these two reports, and we can have a discussion on them afterwards. But the main point seems to be indeed what you see here on this slide. There's a clear link about what happens outside the European Union and what is needed then inside. So in that sense, I read it as there's something changing in the world, and we need to respond to that. And that is a sort of a running line through both of the reports, I would say. In the debates over the past year or so, perhaps 2 years, this is usually called the EU's global awakening, right? So like if suddenly the European Union realizes that there is a world outside that is changing, and that need to respond to those changes, to those changes. So what are then the possible changes that are also highlighted in the reports that the EU needs to respond to? Well, a few are mentioned here. Demographic changes, for instance. I mean, we can look at statistics and see that the European population will not be as large in comparison to other regions in the world in a number of decades. So something will change in the balance, in the demographic balance on a global scale. Something is also changing in terms of security. As we can see in the world, there's a number of wars going on. Willem mentioned already a few of them, and things are not getting better. And the EU, as with every crisis, seems to be responding to that, and there's a sort of inherent need then to change things also there. The other thing mentioned here is unilateralism, which is a sort of new trend, and I'll come back to that in a minute as well, where we seem to be moving from a multipolar, multilateral system to states that are actually more focused on unilateral initiatives. I'll come back to that when we're going to discuss trade in a minute. So in a sense, what you see also in the reports is a comparison between what the European Union is doing, what it has been doing, and what, for instance, the United States and China are doing. And then it's interesting to see, as also the reports show, that, for instance, the US has made an enormous growth over the past decades. And the EU has also grown, but not at the same pace. And this is considered to be worrisome in a way. Our GDP has risen as well, but if you compare that to the US GDP, it's almost a fraction of that. And that is considered as a reason that we're sort of lagging behind. And if we continue this pace, we will be an underdeveloped region. Both Letta and Draghi use quite dramatic terms to indicate Europe's future in that respect. So what I intend to do is to focus on basically two areas. There's many things in reports, as you probably have seen, and I pick out security and trade as two of the policy areas that I would like to concentrate on. Also because they're very much related, and also the two reports really link the two the two policy areas of security and trade, calling it also a foreign economic policy. This is what the European Union needs, a genuine EU foreign economic policy in which foreign policy and economic objectives are much more linked to each other than they used to. And indeed, again, something quite dramatic, to retain our freedom from the rest of the world. So we'll come back to that as well. Next slide, please. So starting there with some of the things that struck me when I read the sections on security and security policy. There is a rising insecurity. That is, geopolitical events are pointing to that. And very concretely, both of the reports, and especially the Draghi report, then focuses on our dependence of, for instance, critical raw materials. Increasingly, and this is nothing new, but it's highlighted a number of times in the reports, increasingly the European Union is no longer able to survive on its own when it comes to raw materials. You might say that has always been the case, but these new raw materials are in particular very, very essential for new developments and innovation in technology. So that is actually what was highlighted. We need to be aware of that, and we need to find answers to that problem. Same thing with the imports, not of raw materials, but basically of technical digital technology, which basically comes from Asia. So we're dependent on other regions in different ways than we were before. That is one of the things that is highlighted in the reports in terms of security. But it's not just about those things. It's also about the physical security, the threats of war in a way, and conflict. It's nothing new that the European Union has not been able to build up its own defense industry, for instance. We are very much fragmented. If you look at the EU treaties, indeed, originally any competences related to defense have stayed in the hands of the member states to a large extent, and it also meant that each and every member state had its own defense industrial policy. And what the reports now argue is that we need to make an end to that. We need to finally now bring our act together and combine the various policy areas that we have on industrial capacity. Far too fragmented, and there's no standardization at all. I find this a very interesting example here. 12 different types of battle tanks in Europe, whereas the US only has one. It's very difficult for the member states to actually work together, to train together, and to actually build up something of a coherent defense. Next one, Willem. So this has already triggered over the past, let's say, past 2 years or so, this has already triggered a number of initiatives at the level of the Commission. So whereas I previously said that defense policy is largely in the hands of the member states, that is still the case. But the European Commission found ways to get around that and actually use a number of legal bases to actually make new initiatives, take new initiatives in the area of defense. For instance, the European Commission can do a lot about industrial policy. So they've used those competences to actually also do something in the area of defense industry. So you see a number of examples here on the slides where the last year and also in 2024, Commission has become very, very active. And these are just examples of Commission initiatives that have been taken and accepted by the member states in the Council to be more active in defense and defense industry. The latest news, of course, is the new Commissioner for Defense and Space. So there will be a commissioner in the new Commission for defense issues. And that is quite something. I remember that everyone was always very, very, very careful about bringing in military and defense issues into European integration. But we've come a long way, and this has become already a policy there. So basically, also what the European Commission, what the Letta report and the Draghi report also argue is that we need to combine things. So security should not be just seen as defense policy, but should be combined with a number of other things, like other countries also do. Financial policy should be brought in, cyber threats, infrastructure, space, health technology. You see them mentioned here. This should then lead to sort of the creation of an Economic Security Council, with even perhaps an Economic Security Minister, as Letta argues. This all pointing to the fact that we can no longer rely perhaps on all our allies. And of course, the election of President Trump will sort of strengthen this idea that we need to get our act together more quickly than we thought before. Next slide. Then slightly moving from security to trade. This is also interesting. We have been working on the basis of multilateral institutions, but that has sort of passed. If you look at what has happened over the past years, things have really changed. And we need to be, according to Draghi in this case, DR, by the way, of course, as you may have found out by now, stands for Draghi Report, LR stands for Letta Report. So Draghi actually argues that it has become time to be more careful about cooperation, not to quit international cooperation at all. We need to be active at the global level as the European Union, active in all multilateral institutions, but also we have to become more aware of protecting our own autonomy. Strategic autonomy was already mentioned as a notion. How to do that? Well, we can all find that in the economic security strategy that was adopted last year, which talks much more than before about possibilities to prevent dumping, to prevent coercion by other countries of our economic policies, dealing with foreign subsidies, technology leakage, enforcing the sanctions actually that we impose against other states. So it's much more about preventing that others will influence what we can do inside in the European Union, and have active and sometimes even aggressive policies towards others, much more than we did before. Partly this has to do, of course, with the crisis that we have been facing in the World Trade Organization, which is not functioning as it used to be, partly because of the dysfunctional the panels and dispute settlement system at the moment, which also resulted in a new sort of atmosphere that perhaps the World Trade Organization, as it used to be, is no longer the place to make trade deals. So we, the European Union, is increasingly, like other states, increasingly turning to free trade agreements that are much more on a bilateral basis. So over the past few years, many more FTAs, free trade agreements, have been concluded. And also, of course, this gives an opportunity to also make specific deals with specific countries, rather than being bound by these World Trade Organization rules that were sort of limiting everyone. That seems to be the new mood. And also, perhaps limiting a bit the role that member states have still played, even in the exclusive competence of trade. There was a larger role for the member states. So less mixity, which implies that less agreements that were concluded both by the European Union and its member states focus on the things that the EU can do by itself. Also by providing a larger role, for instance, for the European Parliament, rather than relying on the national parliaments to get legitimacy for all these new agreements that have been concluded and will be concluded. Next one. So basically, what this tells us is what the European Union actually wants to do, at least what Draghi wants the European Union to do, is focus more on this case-by-case trade deals, as Trump would say, actually, on the number of topics. So first of all, let's make sure that we keep the barriers low, so that we at least do not allow other states to block everything and to prevent the European Union to actually benefit from developments elsewhere. AI is an example that is used very, very often. So allow the European Union to be a part of that whole new development by keeping the barriers low. The second one is keep the level playing field as it is, or even improve that. We know that, and both reports point to that we are over-regulating things sometimes in the European Union. In other states, it's much more easy to deal with a number of things. Of course, the challenge at the end of the day will be how to deal with that, right? So we value, for instance, sustainability goals very much. So we don't want to loosen the standards that we now have on the environmental aspects of trades to just become more competitive. So this will actually be one of the challenges that's being discussed also. And secure critical supply chains. Make sure that we always have access and remain to have access to the elements that we actually need to keep on producing also high technology stuff. A thing that I find quite interesting is also that there is something especially in the Draghi report on sort of limiting the role of the member states in that sense. For instance, if we're talking about investments, which is also still largely in the hands of the member states, we see that sometimes investment negotiations are done by the smaller states. What Draghi actually tells us is this is not a smart thing to do. Smaller states do not have the negotiation strength or power to actually get to a good deal. So let's slowly move to also Europeanize, if you want, the whole investments part that we're dealing with. Strengthening indeed of this investment screening mechanism, what is going on, et cetera, et cetera. How are we dealing with that? And perhaps moving that from the member state level to the EU level. Yes, now indeed, the final one from my side. So combining everything, I think the picture is quite clear that both reports would like to convey to us. We're lagging behind. We need industrial strategies that combine multiple policies. What we have done in the European Union, and of course there's all kinds of good reasons for that, is that we have divided the different policies, sometimes even over different treaties, with different competences, but we need to find a way now to combine all those policies, fiscal policies, trade policies, competition, etc., to make this whole work. Because this is actually what another state would also do. This is what the US does. This is what China does. They are able, much more than the European Union, to combine those different policies. So this is, I think, one of the main takeaways from the Draghi report. The other thing is, of course, and again, nothing new, that we're dealing with decision-making rules that are not very helpful. It takes a long time in the European Union to take a decision. You can see here, on average, 19 months, whereas China and the US are able to do this much more faster and react to new developments. So we need to find a way in Europe to finally improve this decision-making process. And this is perhaps the most difficult one, especially, and we'll come to that perhaps later, especially in the current political climate, where there's not so much of a tendency by member states to leave things more to the collective. They rather keep things in their own hands. Final point is indeed then on CFSP, Common Foreign and Security Policy. Over the past, let's say again, 2 years or so, a bit longer, the discussion on moving to qualified majority voting in foreign policy has been tabled over and over again by different presidencies, by different institutions. And it's about time also to take a look at that. How can we take foreign policy decisions preventing each and every member state, and even certain member states, to have a veto and to veto those foreign policy decisions, and basically then to block the European Union to play its role at the global level. Thanks very much, Willem. I'll leave it at this for the moment, but I'm pretty sure we'll come back to a number of points later.
All right, thank you so much, Ramses. It's always an awkward position online, right? But I do want to ask for a little applause, as silent as that may be. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ramses, for your contribution, for sharing those insights about the external relations. And you're rightly so, eh? Perhaps external relations are the new internal relations in terms of prominence, right? Particularly when it comes to these. I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with that.
This is what I've said over the past 20 years. So yes, I agree.
Fantastic. So before we move to the next speaker, I'd like to just highlight that I believe the chat box is working now. I think it was disabled before, but thank you so much to those that highlighted that to me. So please leave your questions for the Q&A to Ramses and Lea, who will start contributing soon in the chat box soon. But thanks again, Ramses. Let's move to the next speaker, Lea Diestelmeier, who will share some thoughts about how the Draghi and the Letta reports are influencing energy policy and law in Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Willem, first of all, for organizing this intriguing format and for inviting me to contribute to it from the energy law perspective. Well, even though I would say probably this first comment and overview is less, let's say, from a strictly legal perspective, but indeed what it is, already setting a disclaimer saying it is an overview and some comments that I have from a second reading, let's say, about the reports. And then also I focused much more on the Draghi report, as I found that it was much more specific and operationalizing actually some very concrete suggestions and recommendations concerning the energy sector. And Letta focused much more, as well as the title also says, as a single market, as a competitive advantage, also in the context of the energy sector, and linked it a little bit to well, the necessary physical components in the energy market as to interconnectedness of the markets, so the need to develop that, the need to, well, then quickly moving, let's say, to technology development for resilience of the energy sector, to then quickly to critical raw materials. But this is what I focused less on, as this was, I focused much more for this purpose now, really on the Draghi report. I will comment a bit on Letta here and there when it was relevant, let's say, from the perspective that I read on Draghi. And then also, again, thanks for including actually the specific energy perspective, because there are, of course, so many other dimensions that are discussed in the report. But as if you had the chance already to have a look at the reports only at a glance, you quickly already understand that energy appears in many of the sections that are discussed actually in the report. But again, let's say for the purpose of now, I focused very much actually at the beginning, literally section number 1, which focuses explicitly, let's say, at the energy sector, and very much so really at the sector setting, the market design, and potentially, let's say, on, well, linking back actually to the external dimension also partly. But there are, of course, many other sections, specifically also section 4, for example, on energy intensive industries. So there's much more to say as a disclaimer than what I will have the chance at least to comment on here, but maybe then in depth indeed in a blog post. Okay, so this was a long disclaimer. Next slide, but already some context. I started also very much indeed where Draghi started defining a problem in the first case. This is also relevant, I think, for my contribution to in the comments that I have, let's say, on this. Quoting, energy is a key driver is a key driver of the competitiveness gap. So saying basically much of the problem that is discussed in the entirety of the report is linked to energy. And then much more specifically, and I allowed myself to take the screenshot here because it's very telling, I think, for what the report indeed setting the scope of it. The price gap essentially between for gas industrial prices and retail prices, and compared to the prices in the US and China. And with the beginning of the invasion of Russia and the Ukraine, of course, this price gap, which already existed, by the way, anyway before, increased tremendously. And well, the report, and I'm getting to this, identifies some of the core problems actually underlying this price gap for energy. But it is indeed quite telling, I think, that this is really the stepping stone, let's say, for developing indeed the entire set of solutions and recommendations for the energy sector based on the identification of price difference in terms to other regions in the world, and the goal indeed to close this price gap in order to improve competitiveness. Now, the key, and I organized the little blocks underneath that screenshot a little bit in the sense that from the left side, focusing more really on the market setting. So most obviously, the European countries have less natural gas less natural gas in their territory than, for example, the US. So they are much more depending actually on imports of natural gas. So this is, of course, one of the main factors influencing price. There's also higher carbon costs attached to it. So that's, of course, one of the flagships, let's say, of climate policy of the European Union, as it is often presented, at least the European Emission Trading Scheme. So these are costs, of course, that are attached to that. The fact that actually natural gas and often also coal are actually the price-setting technologies in the wholesale markets for electricity as well. Most notably, this was mentioned, and that's quite telling as well, that it was for 63% in 2022 the price-setting technology for electricity that was in some member states close to 50% based on renewables. So there is a question more of like how to design actually markets, and is then linked to that the other block mentions that one of the problems is then as well that long-term pricing tools for electricity, and most notably electricity actually based on renewable energy sources, are underdeveloped, and the report strongly recommends here, for example, power purchase agreements for the longer term as a potential alternative to decouple electricity prices actually from the gas price in order to lower that gap. Well, if you closely look, you could actually put a question mark there already. To which extent is it actually coupled? Well, factually yes, but of course it is only coupled for the times that gas powered plants actually need to kick in order to serve the last bit of demand that cannot be covered by renewable energies. I'm also getting to that in a bit. So this is more market related, let's say, problems that are identified that are causing, let's say, this the price gap. There is also some infrastructural problems identified here briefly is summarized, and I took that from the report also, but there's of course much more to it. Physical bottlenecks, so to which extent can we actually interconnect markets? So this is then relating also more to the Letta report, saying where Letta also emphasizes much more actually the need to increase interconnection capacity between member states in order to physically also reap the benefits of an internal market actually. So energy, of course, depends on the transport through infrastructure. So how can we further leverage actually interconnectedness of the markets? So that's, let's say, the main component to the physical dimension. And then more on the right side, looking more on the, well, if you want, so regulatory side. So one of the problems also identified lengthy permitting for renewable energy sources and generation capacity, also for grids. There are also high tax and subsidies attached to the energy price, which is all contributing together to this enormous price gap that is identified as really the problem scope for this section, let's say, discussed in the report. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what the report does then, from identifying this problem scope of this price gap, essentially identifying, and this is not, let's say, following the structure of the report, but this is what I got, let's say, from all the recommendations that I mainly identified, focusing one of the measures, decarbonization, of course, setting in for renewables. This is also going throughout the report saying, okay, we have to move away from fossil fuels, and that will clearly, of course, then reduce the dependency on imports, which are one of the main routes indeed for this increased price gap. And indeed would also potentially lower than the effect that gas-fired power plants potentially have on the electricity prices, even if they are on renewable energy sources, or also nuclear, as the report also points out, that this is also a carbon neutral technology. The report then identifies actually three main, there are many more, but for leveraging decarbonization, three main recommendations, again, organized along what the market should look like. So decoupling remuneration of renewable energy sources and nuclear as well from fossil-based generation. So basically trying to stimulate, again, these PPAs or two-way contract for differences, so trying to provide support and investment certainty for renewable energy sources through different means, and thereby also at the same time providing to leverage, let's say, the lower cost, the lower marginal cost benefit, let's say, and advantage of renewable energy sources for final consumers. Also to foster investments and coordination of grid developments, and I'm getting to this also later because the Draghi report here and as well also the Letta report, they see a strong, very strong role for the European Union in doing so. And the third one, then responding, let's say, to the other third block that I mentioned under as one of the problems, simplify, accelerate, streamline permitting and administrative procedures for renewable energy sources, flexibility technologies, such as storage, for example, and grids as well. So again, these are three main, let's say, there are many more, but these are the main, let's say, that I picked out now to discuss a little bit. Recommendations for leveraging actually decarbonization in the context to close the price gap. Next slide, please. And the second one, and that's then more, let's say, if you want, so looking more at the old world, leveraging security of supply. So one is indeed moving away from fossil fuels in order to reduce dependency and potential price volatility of especially natural gas. And the second one is then still saying, okay, we might not be able to do it all with renewables and questioning also whether, in which time frame this is a realistic goal. Saying we also need to ensure security of supply, and that essentially has two goals: reducing costs again. So security of supply has three dimensions in terms of availability of resources, reliability of infrastructure, and indeed affordability for final customers. So reducing costs for final users, and ensuring indeed availability of resources. And here they also see quite a strong role again for the European Union. For example, saying, could the European Union act as a single buyer entity for natural gas in order to reinforce joint procurement, let's say, for natural resources? So not having all the member states going themselves to the resource market and try to secure their spot, but leverage kind of a buyer power of the European Union. I leave it like this, but this is proposed. Also in that way, potentially, and that's why I linked it quite closely, potentially move away from spot link pricing. So, and again, ensuring a longer price certainty, and not being so depending and on volatility on short-term pricing, and also try to again emphasize a European coordinated approach, especially for industry. And that's then also a part that is more discussed, let's say, in the other section that I'm not highlighting here, but for energy intensive industries have quite a special place in that report. Regulate financial markets. So there's a lot of financial products related to gas trading. So how can we also ensure more regulatory oversight over those markets, so that there are trading houses were quite put in the spotlight in the report, which I found also quite interesting because, they have, of course, they have the interest in getting a piece of the cake as well. So here the idea that relates then much more indeed to the financial dimension actually, and how the financial market actually interlinks with the energy sector. So proposing here further regulation essentially. And that's the last one, again, then responding to the right side, let's say, of the order of things that as I place them here, proposing a common maximum level for surcharges for energy, including tax and levies and network charges. And that's quite far-reaching if you're a bit familiar, of course, with the energy sector, not even with the energy sector, but proposing such a measure for the purpose, indeed, security of supply, in order to reduce prices. Okay, next slide, please. Now, there are many more recommendations in the report that I couldn't discuss, but only from the few that I mentioned. I think you can, if you look first at decarbonization and thinking, okay, the idea is to push renewables and to develop infrastructure, potentially flexibility. And on the other hand, the report acknowledges very much that there is a need for security of supply, which we need to cover short, medium term with still fossil fuels, gas most prominently in the report, be it LNG or natural gas imported from other countries. Which might, let's say, and this is more where I'm entering, let's say, the commenting part of this contribution, it might trigger, or it might at least raise the question, aren't there some inconsistencies, and how the line should be drawn actually between those two sets of measures, decarbonization and security of supply. Now, this is also nothing new in the energy world, saying there is always a trade-off between sustainability, security of supply, and if you add to the trilemma even the goal of competitiveness, or you might call it also affordability, or economic setting, what way. But I think the report has a lot of those, well, I call them now inconsistencies, but they are simply dilemmas, trilemmas, reflecting essentially a political debate that is already existing in the energy sector anyway for a long time already. And I think that the report, and this is, again, maybe a bit of a criticism, at least a comment, there is a lot in the report and there is a lot also not in the report. And I think that is essentially where a comment is interesting and where debate actually starts. Now, coming back to the problem scope, and this is probably where I would say that the problem is quite narrowly defined in saying we need to close a price gap. And while all the proposed solutions might add potentially to closing this price gap, they also imply indeed many of those trade-offs between, for example, reducing prices at all costs might not result necessarily in affordability, which is essentially a goal because it is about bills. Who can actually afford energy and at which costs, and for whom is this available? The same is the case for sustainability. There is a lot of emphasis in accelerating, simplifying procedures, administration for renewable energy technologies, for infrastructure. Now, if you have had, just open the newspaper, I would say, and you read about any energy-related infrastructure problem or project, there is always, let's say, some reason behind usually why it is so terribly complex and potentially also lengthy. There is a lot at stake, let's say, between, or a lot of tension at the moment also increasingly between developing renewables rapidly versus environmental and more broadly sustainability goals at stake. So here the report mainly focuses indeed on the push for renewables. And the same for security of supply. There is a lot of focus on resource adequacy. So how can we ensure, let's say, that there is sufficient natural gas available, and how can we ensure that we increase price certainty, not even reducing this, but price certainty over long term. But what about if we speak about security of supply? Why not starting more at the lower hanging fruits? And there is, I think, a lot of potential that has not been mentioned, speaking about efficiency gains or even further reaching sufficiency gains. So how can we actually push towards more from the demand side before, let's say, at all costs pushing for resource adequacy on the basis of fossil fuels? Next slide, please. And this brings me a little bit already to the end. So just to mention again that there is a strong focus on European energy governance for all the mentioned recommendations. This also goes in line with what the Letta report discussed and mentioned. There are a couple of recommendations that are explicitly mentioned, such as any decision, let's say, related to market functioning, cross-border relevance should be taken centrally. There should be a central regulatory oversight. So that's at the moment ACER, the Agency for Cooperation of Energy Regulators. Potentially the powers would need to be increased. Letta even proposes what he referred to as the Clean Energy Delivery Agency, delivering technical support, monitoring funding, kind of a one-stop shop entity for advice. Generally a stronger role for regulators, so potentially also at national level. So much of these trade-offs, let's say, as I discussed them in the context of the energy trilemma, are supposed to be then solved at a European level and discussed in the first place at the European level, ideally at least. My closing question, let's say, for this is essentially, is the problem at the beginning not set too narrowly, focusing on closing this price gap for the sake of competitiveness, and doing that at whatever it takes, kind of bluntly speaking, whatever it takes recommendations. So there is so much more complexity, I understand, and there are, this is a beginning, but I think that the energy sector is so much more, and there's so much more at stake than closing a price gap yeah, and I'm simplifying this now a bit, but I think that there is quite some room for debate, at least for things that have not been discussed in the report, to leave it like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lea. Thank you for your critical remarks related to the Letta and the Draghi reports from this EU energy law perspective. I feel like my internet connection conked for a little bit, but I'm back. Good to note that I'm back. Thank you so much, Lea, for your perspectives on these topical issues, and also for highlighting these, I think, very important dilemmas, right? It's also a feeling that I got from reading the reports. There's a lot that these reports want to achieve, but how does that work internally? So let me move to to some questions that have been posed in the chat box. Thanks so much for those. Let me maybe stick with a question that perhaps Lea, you could respond to, and of course Ramses, also feel free to chime in whenever you feel like you want to. One of the questions that was posed is this point that you mentioned about that there's virtually and the comment in the chat box is quite would you say quite strong when it comes to this, is that the sustainability angle really is left out, but also more broadly, right? But could you perhaps also phrase it a bit more positively, that at least in the energy sector, net zero gets a mention and energy gets a mention, whereas in other fields, it's totally left out entirely. So perhaps some thoughts on that, and perhaps you could also reflect a bit on that this is a very conservative vision of economic growth, as the comment in the chat box mentioned.
Yeah, thank you very much. I read the comment as well. Of course, I mean, I commented now with critical glasses, but this is the starting point indeed for debate. I think that indeed it's positive that decarbonization is a leveraging measure in the first place to be seen, let's say, but I think, and then I'm entering again in the critical moment, that already, let's say, by mentioning decarbonization as one of the measures, it's mainly justified by price-based aims, by closing that price gap, while there is so much more, of course, attached to it, and we don't even have to look very far in the future to see already that it is not only about economic resilience, but very much also about climate resilience, and that climate resilience doesn't necessarily stop at, let's say, simplifying and accelerating renewable energy generation sources. Yes, that is an important point, but there is so much more, and we know that already. This is nothing new, and I mean, that was also now in the revised directive for renewable energy support. This was pointed out, but also pushing for that by renewable acceleration areas. but there's so much discussion already going on already in that field. So, and this, yeah, it just, yeah, to say it is a starting point, but there is so much more, let's say, to leave it short. But I agree with, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Because I will leave the energy question for now, because I'd like to pose one of the first questions. Anyone that opens the chat box gets at least a mention during the Q&A, right? So it's a question from Margozata Kozak, a colleague of mine at the Utrecht University. And she points out that, and I think this might also be a question also for Ramses perhaps, but I'll leave that to you two, about the point that this is very much written from an old Europe perspective, these reports, particularly the Draghi report has ensured that as well. And I think this question really tries to point that out, and to also note that, you know, it's perhaps one-sided, right? What about the perspective from, say, newer member states?
Yes, I also noted that it's difficult to reflect on that because it's basically due to the composition of the Draghi team in a way, right? Which was actually quite a large team, and it was quite a long process as well. So I'm not sure if the team did not actually take into account many of the perspectives from the, let's say, eastern side of the European Union. What is of course behind this is that the new accession, possibly the new possible accession of new member states, is taken into account, especially if you look at the sections that deal with decision making, right? The already very difficult decision making at the moment will only become more difficult with new member states entering. So I see that behind the words that we've seen in the report. If you allow me, Willem, also one reflection on the fact that sustainability or the Green Deal is not so much left in. I mean, that's also a feeling I get, and it's perhaps also something for the discussion, that what do we want in the end, right? Because one of the arguments seemed to be that some of the other global regions are much more lenient on some of the standards that we value a lot, right? On sustainability or perhaps other issues. So what are we willing to give up to reach the same level of competitiveness? And we're probably all aware of this famous phrase that the United States innovates, China imitates, and the EU regulates. And so we are the one that are always making more and more rules to make it more and more difficult for everyone. And behind these reports is also a sort of call to perhaps loosen up. Let's see if we can reach another level by having less regulation of everything, but at what cost, indeed, as also Lea indicated.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I see a question coming up from Sibylle de Vries as well. I think I'll perhaps also leave that for after the break, perhaps also something that Hans or Charlotte can reflect on. If we take your last comment, Ramses, to hard regulate less, right? We should perhaps take a different approach. I'd like to take from the question from Victor Chep on this. He notes this need that both reports talk about a need to create a foreign economic policy, and his questions to relate, how do we do that, right? And that's something, I think, a broader question that underlies many of these proposals. What's required in a legislative sense to implement them? Does it require, as he mentions in his question as well, does it imply potentially treaty change, or does it imply using existing legal bases in a more creative way? So more internal market policies and a broader interpretation of that.
You want me to say something on that? Well, with some hesitation, because I know that Victor actually is the expert in that particular area. So I know where the question comes from, but it's absolutely right, of course, that it's very difficult for the European Union to combine, for instance, foreign policy and internal market issues, simply because, first of all, the policies are in different treaties with different roles of the institutions, different decision-making procedures, etc., etc. But what we have seen over the past years is actually that CFSP, Common Foreign and Security Policy, is becoming normalized more and more, right? So it's it's taken along in all external relations, and links are being found between trade policy and foreign policy, between other internal market policies and foreign policy. So the Commission has actually been quite creative in finding possibilities to combine different legal bases and to sort of bypass the strange things that we somehow invented in Maastricht at the time. So I see a potential here. I don't necessarily see a need for a treaty change, because that is also part of the question. Ideally, of course, we would start all over with having just one treaty and then combining everything, but I don't see that happening on short term.
Lea, would you like to reflect on this as well, this aspect? What's required in a legislative sense from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, focusing on the energy market, you would quickly come, let's say, to Article 194 TFU, where there might be then a discussion about what's when coming, let's say, more to the horizontal recommendations that are made in the report concerning more powers indeed at EU level, more central regulatory oversight, and what essentially where well, what is already at national level often a question where actually, yeah, policy starts and regulatory oversight begins. So because there might be much indeed transferred, which is of course in a highly political sector as the energy sector is, much member states might not be as willing indeed to transfer that competence further, and less so probably in the rather current political context in many of the member states. So would need to think further, but probably for sure not easy to make it short.
That's the best cliffhanger to end anything with, and to also write more publications and blog posts, right? Not easy. But maybe whilst I've got you, there was one question that also related to your topic more particularly. It's about the efficiency of the aggregate EU platform and your thoughts on that, and whilst reinforcing joint procurement of natural gas.
I saw that question already, indeed. I was curious more about what terms I would need to think about efficiency in order to answer that question. I cannot really say anything about the efficiency. Well, efficiency probably in terms of, or more effectiveness probably in reinforcing buyer power of the EU as a single entity, let's say, to buy natural gas, as far as I understand this here. There's a new message now, does it? No. Well, again, this might be a way for, this might be part of the solution as the problem sketched, to close the price gap, to potentially get better deals for EU countries for natural gas. This might be a way. First question would be indeed, are member states willing to give up that competence and pool this kind of buying power? Is there political willingness? And second, again, is this in the order of priorities, let's say, the thing to do, or do we need to think again a bit broader? But yes, this is, let's say, probably a valid suggestion for the problem that is sketched.
All right, thank you so much, Lea. It warms my heart to hear the word procurement being dropped, right? At least in this webinar, even though I'm not presenting myself. So it's very nice. Thank you also for your reflections on that, Lea. I suggest everyone keeps their gunpowder dry, as you say in Dutch, for now. Just if you have questions, keep posting them in the chat box, and we'll get back to them in the second block of questions. For now, I see that it's 3 o'clock, and I think it's time to briefly stretch our legs and to grab a cup of coffee, maybe have a brief toilet break, whatever is necessary for you to have a fresh mind and soul to return to the second block. We will reconvene in 5 minutes. To not take away from that, that means 3:06. So we'll reconvene in 5 minutes at 3:06. We'll see you in a second. All right, I see that it's 6 past. Just a quick check. Can you see the sheets now, Charlotte? Yes, all right, great. Let's wait a couple more seconds for everyone to return, and then we will commence. All right, welcome back from this from your brief break. I hope you're ready for the second hour of this 2-hour webinar. We're moving towards consumer law and a more economic law, perhaps competition law perspective in the second part, with 2 presentations, and then we'll follow up with a Q&A again. And then, of course, feel free to continue asking the questions that you might have in the chat box so we can discuss them following their presentations. Next up is Charlotte Pavillon, our professor of consumer law. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Willem, for convening this fantastic seminar on the 2 very interesting reports. I really enjoyed reading them, but it was a lot to take in. There is really, there are so many different ideas and propositions, and actually, when focusing on consumer protection, it really helped to have a perspective when you're reading those reports, to keep in mind that there is a lot to make needed to make an internal market working like it does. It shows, it highlights. Also, both reports highlight how incredibly complicated, how incredibly complex the internal market is, and how many different aspects should be taken into account if you need to make Europe, if you want to make Europe more, the EU more competitive. You really will need to look at many different aspects, and consumer protection is definitely one of them. And I really would have expected consumer protection to play a bigger role. Like Lea, I was actually looking at the number of mentions of consumer protection in both reports. I started with the Letta report, and actually consumer was mentioned like 100 times in the report. Which isn't a lot, actually, if you think about how important consumer protection has been since the 80s to facilitate the functioning of the internal market. How many different consumer protection directives and also in recent times also more regulations. And then I will define consumer protection in a very broad sense, encompassing also privacy rules and maybe also the most recent developments concerning the digital markets, platform regulations, etc., etc. And these consumer rules, consumer protection rules, they have been key to the creation of the internal market, because consumers need to enjoy a high level of consumer protection. That always has been the idea. And this high level of consumer protection should also be harmonized, so as to create a level playing field, and consumers should expect the same level of protection whether they are going to Romania or Ireland or Portugal. And traders should expect also the same rules wherever they go. So next slide, please. We are looking at the Letta report. So I just told you the consumer protection is mentioned 15 times, and I control F the word consumer, and it was mentioned 101 times. But actually, one of the questions when looking at how competitive the EU is, and that's, I thought most of you would know about the tensions between Elon Musk and the Commission in recent times about how much protection is needed online, etc. And Ramses just told us about the leniency of other parts of the world concerning environmental aspects. The same goes for consumer protection. We really enjoy a very high level of consumer protection in the EU. And actually, I would have expected this high level of consumer protection to be discussed, at least because you could question how much protection is actually needed in each and every field of the economy. Just to give you an example, the right of withdrawal with e-commerce, it offers a lot of protection to consumers, but in a sense, you could say, okay, consumers know their way now, they know how to buy online. Do you still need the same level of protection because markets evolve and consumer habits evolve? And when we look at the Letta report, we see that changing consumer preferences are mentioned and taken into account, but they are coupled to the need for more protection. And that was striking. In both reports, there is a plea for more consumer protection. I'm convinced that there are new, indeed, in the digital sphere, there are new services, banking services, etc., online, which really ask for more protection. That's being acknowledged, and that is a great thing. But it also means that there will be new rules, or there is need for new rules. Maybe, I don't know, better protection through better information implies new information duties for traders. So I'm not entirely sure how this relates to the plea for simplification and deregulation, but I'll come to that later on. Then there is a plea for full harmonization also because of the complexity of consumer protection. Like I said, there are so many rules on so many different topics, from timeshare to credit, consumer credit contracts, from unfair commercial practices, including dark patterns, to unfair contract terms. There is a really large array of measures, of protection measures. And it's very complex. When we look at the new rules pertaining to green claims, for example, there are very complicated new rules for the substantiation of green claims, and actually looking at the different provisions in the new directives, it's becoming very also daunting for, I think, for enforcers, but also for traders to implement all those rules. So and the differences between member states when there is room for national measures, and there's always, at some point, there is always some leeway for member states to add, or at least for private regulation, self-regulation, to add another layer of protection above the harmonized rules. It makes everything very complicated. And just to give you a recent example, yesterday it was in the news that food labeling protection is diverging a lot at European level, and there are gaps in the rules, but there is a maze of constantly changing labels and very different rules across the EU. So there are a lot of differences between member states, and there are a lot of rules that, yes, are applicable at the same time, and it's not very clear what traders should prioritize. And there is, and that's very interesting in the Letta report, there is a proposition to enact an European Code of Business Law. So that's a very interesting proposition, I think. So next slide, please. And yeah. Great. And there is also this plea for better enforcement based on experiences in mostly Nordic countries. And I also saw a quick reference to better compensation and collective redress. There is the need to tackle infringements of EU law by non-EU traders, East Asian platforms, for example. We have seen the recent efforts, European efforts. National enforcement bodies have started to take actions, and I think this is also already the first sign. This is really a very good proposition as well. More enforcement is needed. Next slide, please. So why do I refer to an over-decorated Christmas tree in my title? Because there is really a lot. In both reports, there is a very large selection of options, of ideas. They are not very concrete, and actually it's not always clear how they interfere with measures like a European Code of Business. How would it relate to consumer protection rules, for example? Would it include them or not? Or how does because I feel the Letta report really like the Draghi report. They have taken a lot of ideas from their teams, include them in a report, and try to reassemble them and to put them in a consistent story. But at the same time, I have the feeling that they wanted to please as many of the participants as possible, but it's not very clear how they are going, how those propositions are going to be really implemented by the member states in the long run. Next slide, please. So the Draghi report does not refer to consumer protection a lot, at least not in part A. But in part B, there is this very interesting proposition for a new competition tool. It refers to areas of potential intervention. So this is actually offering a little bit more focus than the Letta report when it comes to consumer protection. It really targets a few concrete fields of consumer law and markets, European market law, where you internal market law, where you would maybe see room for a special action by law enforcers. And interestingly, the example that is mentioned in the Draghi report is one that refers to behavioral biases. And I feel like this is a problem that is common to almost any market that is developing at the moment. So I feel that this proposition it looks like it's really targeted, but at the same time, I think it would actually be applicable to any field or any sector of the economy at the moment, because most are now digitalized to a large extent, and we all know that in the digital market, consumer biases are really enhanced. So I feel this is actually applicable to many different sectors and markets. So yeah, good idea, but also like in the Letta report, not very concrete. Can I have the next slide, please? So Draghi is also pleading for, or us at least not. He is not pleading for full harmonization. That's a difference. But he's pleading for deregulation and simplification. But one common aspect is the plea for better enforcement. Again, examples from abroad, like the Federal Network Agency in Germany and the US Federal Trade Commission is mentioned. So different examples, but the same idea, joint enforcement, so streamlining and merging enforcement efforts. And it all also it pins down to the Commission getting more competences in the field of enforcement. And that's, I think, a very good idea. And it's something that is really necessary, like in competition law. I feel those fields of law, competition law, consumer law, they are so tight, so narrowly tied that we will need more enforcement at the European level, the efforts to tackle infringements of consumer law by non-EU traders would be much more effective. And I feel this will need political support, of course, of the member states, but I feel this is really a big opportunity. Next slide, please. So a very short comparative analysis. Competitiveness suffers from a lack of, and this is a very long list. European consumer law lacks clarity of rules. Rules are not always consistent, indeed, because there are more, for example, information duties that are being added to old ones, but I feel that they don't have a clear idea of the already applicable rules, and then they add new ones, and there are really inconsistencies between rules. It's not uniformized, and it's becoming increasingly complicated, and it's nearly impossible to enforce all the rules. So national enforcement bodies have to prioritize. The priorities are diverging across Europe, so it's a mess. Actually, it's really a mess. So we really need simplification. And I read yesterday about the omnibus approach to the European sustainability goals. At the European level, the Commission is planning onto merging different regulations that have been really enacted quite recently. I really would like a similar approach to consumer law, because I think there is really also there a big opportunity to simplify consumer protection. Both reports recommend more protection, but they have a very different approach. Whilst Letta puts the emphasis on information duties, which are not really working, I feel. They're a bit passé. The Draghi report emphasizes the need for example, the protection of elderly, the protection of consumers that suffer from biases. But this points at a quite fragmented approach. And like I said, I'm not sure how it relates to deregulation efforts. Full harmonization, or at least simplification of rules, hindering getting rid of discrepancies between member states that follow from minimum harmonization directives mainly, and more enforcement and cooperation, preferably at the EU level. And next slide, please. This is really a non-exhaustive list of the risks, and I think I fear the feasibility of many of these quite broadly worded propositions is not guaranteed in view of the past, because full harmonization has not been very successful until now, because of the interplay with national law, for example, because of the remedial autonomy. That's a major point. General clauses are enabling national interpretations of European rules. And MS-May clauses, like one of my colleagues has coined the possibility for member states, even under the regulations, to deviate from European rules. More protection, more consumer rights. This is an interesting one, because it would lead to more complexity. But if we look also at the limits of consumer protection in view of the green transition, I think this is really a missed opportunity. I think both reports could have had a look at where consumer law is actually also hindering the green transition, and to responsibilize the consumer a little bit more. But that's an entire discussion, an entirely different discussion, I guess. But this is one also of the aspects that should be taken into consideration if they are going to revise consumer law and simplify consumer law. And I think the strongest point in the reports, both reports, is the emphasis on enforcement. I feel this is really where there is a lot to be gained. But there's still a weakness. There are huge differences in approach between member states, and I feel that this is something that is being ignored to a certain extent. It's mentioned in the footnotes, but it's really there are major differences between member states in between the emphasis on certain breaches, but also different views on what is possible in terms of private enforcement. And there is a lack of staff and means. And that's something that's being underlined in the reports, but it's really 100% up to the member states to change things in this field. Last slide, please. So what's next? This is my last slide, and actually I took a look at the Budapest Declaration 2 weeks ago, or last week, I don't know, and there is no mention whatsoever to consumer protection rules. It stresses the need for simplification, so I hope there will be also room to simplify the very detailed and complex consumer protection rules, because there is this complexity is also hindering the enforcement of the rules, and traders are really suffering from the administrative burden. So we really should look for more more streamlined rules. And one positive thing is that the Consumer Protection Cooperation Regulation, that's all about public enforcement, is being revised at the moment. It's being reviewed. So this review has started, and the review takes into consideration the many proposals, many ideas from mainly the Letta report. So that's just an example of the concrete impact of the reports already at this stage. So thank you all, and I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. It's always good to end on a high, on a positive note, right? Also, thank you so much to all the panelists so far for making my job very easy in terms of time management. I'm setting the bar very high for Professor Vedder, of course, as he's about to commence his contribution. I also look forward to the discussions. Feel free to share your questions and notes in the chat box, of course, and then we'll come back to them after, of course, the contribution by our economic law professor. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem. And also a big thanks to Charlotte, Ramses, and Lea for sharing their thoughts, because of course we've coordinated this a bit, but when you actually see the presentations and you find out that there's so much overlap and coherency happening, it's just amazing. So fluffy on the facts and the future. I'm afraid that's my take on both Letta and Draghi. Fluffy in the sense that whenever I explain rules to students, I call them, okay, they're hard and simple, clear rules, or they're fluffy. And if they're fluffy, you can basically take them any way. And I'm afraid I do think that both Letta and Draghi are fluffy as regards their suggestions, the future, the direction the internal market or the EU as more generally should take. But more problematically, and this is probably the scientist in me, they're also fluffy on the facts. And to explain that a bit more, I'll start with a bit of a step back to reflect on what exactly is the relation between competition, competitiveness, where apparently we have a problem, and, well, the future as I see it happening. And so that's also the subtitle for my presentation, a reflection on competitiveness, but also sustainability in the Letta and the Draghi reports, because of course I couldn't resist also thinking about the relation between competition, competitiveness, and sustainability. Or, and this is to adapt from Kubrick's brilliant movie, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Sustainable Main Battle Tanks. And that takes a page from Ramses' presentation, who of course got this little fact thingy from the Draghi report, where Draghi says, well, we have 12 main battle tanks in operation in the European Union, whereas the US manufactures only 1. And when I hear a little fact like that as a competition lawyer, I immediately start thinking, okay, so is having a monopoly, because that's what you have when you have one type of main battle tank, is that a good thing? Not inherently. I mean, most economists would say that having a monopoly is not a good thing. So maybe having 12, and actually the number is a bit exaggerated, It's one of the aspects of being fluffy on the facts. So there are basically 4 types of main battle tanks that are being exploited in the Netherlands. In the European Union at the moment. Maybe having 4 different battle tanks isn't such a bad thing after all. So can I have my next slide, please? What is the relation between the internal market, conditions of competition, and competitiveness? So the internal market, as we all know, it's an area of free movement and a system ensuring that competition is not distorted. They tried to remove that, but it got in through the back door. So we still have a system ensuring that competition is not distorted. And to have that system, you need to have equal conditions of competition. So that boils down to what we would call harmonization, making sure that there is a level playing field throughout the European Union. But we want this level playing field to also have a certain high level of protection. So whether it's a high level of consumer protection, a high level of sustainability, a high level of worker protection, basically we want a high level of protection. And if we have that, if we have these equal and also high levels of protection throughout the European Union, that will ensure the competitiveness of the European Union. Within the European Union, so to make sure that a trader, wherever they do business, it could be selling stuff in China, in Finland, in Portugal, in Greece, the similar rules throughout the European Union will guarantee competitiveness throughout the European Union as well. But, and that's very interesting, and it also harks back to something that Ramses mentioned, it would also enhance competitiveness of the EU in relation to third countries. And this is the famous Brussels effect, the idea that the EU is also an exporter of norms. GDPR or other sustainability types of rules have generally been adopted in third countries. Many producers worldwide consider complying with EU rules as a recipe for making sure that they have credibility to be traded throughout the globe. And the Brussels effect relies, at least in part, upon our buyer power, upon the fact that it's attractive for producers all over the world to want to sell to the European Union. But here, that's where my big but comes, competitiveness is declining. If for some reason we're losing out in the, let's call it GDP growth battle, we may sooner or later become irrelevant as buyers of products. So sooner or later, producers may say, well, yeah, I don't really care about complying with the European Union's rules because, hey, they're only a tiny part of all the products that I'm going to sell worldwide anyway. And this got me thinking, and this also connects to some of the comments in the chat. Let's take a step back. What we're facing here is a reduced growth in production. So the traditional model is that our production, GDP would be a measure for that, needs to grow every year. And if I translate that to my position, my production as an academic is in the form of articles. And if there needs to be a growth in my production every year, that means that this year I need to write, let's say, 4 articles. The next year it needs to be 5, the year thereafter 6, the year thereafter 7. There comes a moment where, frankly, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to grow my productivity anymore. Of course, what's an extra article by Professor Vedder ever going to do in terms of harm? If we translate that into economic terms, it means that I also want more money. I'm going to earn more money every year. And I'm also going to spend that more money. And I'm invariably going to spend part of that on stuff or travel or something else that has a carbon footprint. So really, I'm wondering about, and this is where I think I do agree with Siba's critical reflection, and this is also what connects to the sustainability more generally. I really do wonder where sustainability was left in both reports, but the Draghi report notably. So if this is the problem, the diagnosis, if you want, what could competition law or competition policy, to cast the net a bit wider, do in this regard? And that's something for my next slide. So from diagnosis to cure, we'll first need to find out what actually causes the problem, the decline in productivity growth. And notably, Draghi pushes the line that this is because innovation is happening elsewhere. We have a couple of unicorns, interesting startups in the EU, but then they migrate to the other side of the Atlantic because that's, of course, where the grass is greener and trees grow much faster. Innovation is happening elsewhere. And this, he says, is caused by overly restrictive rules and an absence of competition laws. So we have a problem with the competition rules. It's also caused by ineffective subsidization. To get things moving, you need funding. Startups are often loss leading. Really fundamental research takes fundamental subsidies. It's simple as that. So we have a problem there. We don't have enough capital floating around to help these unicorn companies grow into, well, the big industrial giants that we see across the Atlantic. And we have red tape. And this is something that's been touched upon definitely by Charlotte already. We have too many rules, too complex rules, unclear rules, etc. So if that's the problem and we have a diagnosis, then we can cure. It's easy. So we need to reduce the red tape, make our subsidies more effective. It's almost like make America great again, and rethink competition law and policy. And I'd like to address these three, elements of the cure, aspects of the cure in that order. So let's start with red tape. That's where I find fluffiness, I'm afraid. Both reports are fluffy on what this red tape actually entails. Letta just quotes some people and says, yeah, people say there is a lot of red tape lying around. Draghi is a bit more specific. And again, the legal scientist in me became really excited and happy when he actually came up with an exact number. There's 11% outright contradiction in the rules that are applicable to certain permitting procedures. I said, wow, how do you even calculate 11% contradiction in all? How do you count the number of rules? Do you just count the rules, or do you also count the exceptions to the rules as separate rules? I need to find out about this. Methodologically, I got so excited. So the first thing I did is I tried to find a footnote. Well, there wasn't really a clear footnote, but I found it was referred to in a Business Europe report. And Business Europe, of course, is the organization representing the business interests in the European Union. Okay, well, let's have a look at them. Had to Google them. I couldn't really find the report itself, but I found a PowerPoint presentation, and the PowerPoint presentation does have the exact 11% and 20% overlapping rules, etc. So the percentages were there, but no substantiation, no methodology there. So to satisfy my curiosity, I was fortunately pointed to the original author of the report, and that was the organization for the Association for the Oil and Gas Production Industry in Europe. We are the voice of the oil and gas production industry in the European Union, and they apparently had done the research that showed the exact percentages. Couldn't find the report. Sent them an email about 2 weeks ago. Haven't had an answer yet. To my mind, that crosses the fluffy box. I want to see the numbers. I want to see the methodology on how they got the numbers. But at least let's just say that there is a problem, and let's just ignore my methodological quarrels with this. They argue that what we have is overly restrictive environmental permitting procedures. So indeed, environmental permits take too long. Yeah, that may well be the case. I'm sure that environmental permits are much quicker to get in China, and they're also quicker to get in the US. Well, if anyone has seen the documentaries about the environmental pollution in China and the environmental pollution in the US, and also the empirically proven facts about the levels of environmental protection in certain parts of the US, I don't mind having long procedures if they have the result of also providing us adequate levels of protection of the environment. Another problem is the lack of access to funding, and that includes private funding. And that's where you get a whole, sort of policy recommendations for creating more European securities organizations. I'm not going to get into that. But another part of the red tape, and that's where I get really interested as well, is insufficient guidance from competition law. Because competition law can actually be problematic and can create what is called a chilling effect on cooperation that may well be necessary to bring Europe across this innovation hurdle, to make us more innovative and grow more quickly. And basically, and that's again where I'm going to connect to something that Charlotte has also mentioned. This has been taken over in the European Council's Budapest Declaration on the new competitiveness deal. We must adopt an enabling mindset based on trust, allowing business to flourish without excessive regulation. Allowing business to flourish based on trust. Well, trust is not exactly the starting point for any competition law appraisal. Most competition authorities are actually quite skeptical of cooperation between companies. And they fear that much of that cooperation actually starts out with and probably ends just like Adam Smith predicted. People of the same trade seldomly meet for merriment and diversion, other than in a conspiracy to raise prices. So the trust doesn't really exist, well, ab initio in competition law. And of course, the magical word here is excessive regulation. What is excessive? What may be excessive from the perspective of a person applying for a permit and wanting to get it within a week may be perfectly normal from the perspective of an NGO or a neighbor trying to save the environment. So the connection to competition law here is translated into a call for more guidance on cooperation. This is one of the suggestions that Draghi makes. We should have more cooperation so that businesses know the room they have for cooperation on, for example, common data spaces. Because when you can pool data, when you can make that data available more generally, you will also be able to train your algorithms more quickly, and that means that you'll get more innovation. So that's the call for reduction of red tape. Now, make subsidization more effective. Yeah, we'll need a lot of funding simply to get innovation to the market. Some of that funding needs to come from public sources, and both reports argue for more European governance of this funding. And Letta has a really interesting proposal where he says part of the state aid budget and what the member states can spend on subsidizing their industry or parts of their industry should become union aid. And this connects to something that's been seen when governments were given almost a complete carte blanche to deal with COVID-19 and before that the economic and financial crisis. And where one of the observations was, well, this does allow the wealthier member states to spend far more on saving their economy than less wealthy member states, simply because they have a bigger budget available to subsidize their industry. And to overcome that, they said, well, at least some of that spending public funds should become, well, decided at the European level. We need more European governance. Well, the Letta suggestion to take some of the national budget and basically make it EU budget is probably very controversial, but what Letta and Draghi also propose, and Draghi really explains that much more, is well, whatever a member state does, it needs to be approved by the European Commission. We all know that state aid requires the Commission's prior approval, and that's where the European Commission could change its policy to have the conditionalities set more at the EU level and say, for example, sure, you can subsidize this company, but then you have to ensure that whatever this company produces will be interoperable, will be accessible for other producers throughout the European Union as well. Another suggestion that they have is increasing use of the IPCEI, that's important project of the Common European Interest instrument. And that's where we have another analogy with the US, that notably Draghi makes an analogy with DARPA. DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, basically the branch of the US government that develops all the really high-tech stuff that then trickles down into the defense industry. DARPA is said to be, well, the creator of the modern internet. Well, can we have something similar in the European Union? That's one of the ideas that's also happening in the Draghi report. So the idea is basically to take subsidization from 27 different member states to the European level to make sure that we have more coordinated subsidization. The interesting question is really going to be, okay, who is then going to decide on exactly what gets subsidized? what innovation in what member state gets what amount of money. That'll be the interesting question. Ideally, that would end up with the European Commission. In a less than ideal world, it's probably still going to boil down to the member states, because I don't see many member states jumping for joy at the thought that some unelected European organization is going to spend their money. So, subsidization. Now, my last slide, please. Rethinking competition law and policy. And this is again where the proposals are rather specific. Current merger control and 101, 102 policies, a policy in relation to cooperation and abuse of dominance, is said to be too restrictive, notably by Draghi. And Draghi proposes two defenses, basically counter arguments that can be put forward by companies that want to merge, despite the fact that that merger would lead to competition problems. And those of you who are well versed in the ways of competition law will immediately recognize Siemens Alstom. Big merger between two train manufacturers, high-speed train manufacturers. Siemens manufactures the ICE, Alstom manufactures TGV. So they're probably the world's leading, but definitely Europe's biggest manufacturers of high-speed trains. They wanted to merge, and they said, we need to merge so that we can become a European champion and meet the competition from abroad. Commission said, yeah, that may well be the case, but when you merge, you will become a monopolist. And I'm afraid competition law doesn't like monopolies, so we'll block the merger. That met with significant counter-offensive from the member states, notably France and Germany said, well, this is a completely stupid, outdated way of administering merger control. And I think that their concerns have made it into the Draghi report. And his solution is future innovation effects must be taken into account. I would call that an innovation defense. So mergers that lead to the creation of a monopoly, to put it simply, should be allowed if the companies in question can prove that their merger is necessary to enhance innovation. And Draghi then operationalizes this by saying, well, for that, the companies need to show that they have actually allocated funds for the innovation, and that these funds will also be spent on the innovation. And that, as a lawyer, immediately gets me thinking, okay, so what's going to happen if after, say, a couple of years, the funds don't get spent on innovation? Does that mean that the European Commission will then revoke its approval of the merger? Will the merger then have to be divested? I'm not sure at all. And this is where it gets fluffy on the future. I'd like to see such proposals thought out a bit more. Same here for resilience and security effects. They need to be taken into account. I would call that a security or resilience defense. So certain cooperation, certain mergers should be allowed if they're necessary to enhance the resilience of the European industry. But that, I guess, only works for European companies that cooperate or merge to enhance resilience. But merger control also applies to, let's say, US companies that want to merge and want to sell their products in the EU, because then you also need merger approval from the European Commission. And the other way around, European companies that want to merge and get, let's say, a resilience defense approval by the European Commission and also want to sell the stuff in the US will also need merger approval across the Atlantic. So how is that going to work? Not sure at all. So we get more room and guidance for cooperation and vertical integration. So more cooperation across the board is I think, the general theme. It's a bit like what Draghi also said in his time as ECB president. Whatever it takes to become more competitive, maybe even a bit less competition. And when competition law fails to address all of these competition problems, we have the new competition tool that is contemplated. And also, just reiterating what Charlotte also said, bounded rationality. I think there are not many economists left these days that would say that humans are in any way perfectly or purely rational. We are probably the embodiment of bounded rationality, and the internet makes that even more of a problem in a way. So the pervasive online marketing is definitely something that triggers even more bounded rationality or consumer binding effects. So rethinking competition law policy is actually where report is quite well thought out, but even then, I have a couple of questions. Now back to my title slide. Will this get us sustainable main battle tanks? Of course, any presentation needs a nice graphic these days. And I said, hey, let's get AI to generate an image of a sustainable main battle tank. So I started out in Dutch, and then it didn't get my question. So I said, okay, can I do it in English as well? So I'm looking for an image of a sustainable main battle tank in a green environment, right? Because that's what competition gets us. It'll get us a main battle tank to scare off the Russians. It'll be sustainable, so we'll be green, and everyone over the world will be willing to buy our sustainable mean green battle tank. And it seems that the image generation is not working as expected. Okay. So much for artificial intelligence, and well, so much for getting us a sustainable main battle tank. The honest answer to the question is, I'm not sure. I don't know whether having more or less competition will make us more or less competitive and will actually get us the result that we want. Because at the end of the day, I don't think we really care about competitiveness as such or about competition. At the end of the day, I think we care about the values that make us join the European Union. So that's my take on Draghi and Letta as far as competition is concerned. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Hans. Also, a digital, non-audible applause for your presentation and your contribution. Very much, it speaks very much to your imagination when you try to create sustainable main battle tanks. Let me kick off the discussion by linking your two presentations, because the Commission as a problem solver came forward in both of your analysis or your reflections. I was wondering if you could delve a bit more into that. If I paraphrase or summarize correctly, and do correct me if I'm wrong, Charlotte, you noted the Commission as perhaps to be able to take on a stronger role, particularly in terms of enforcement. And also, Hans, you noted that the Commission could take on perhaps a role of distributing funds or allowing funds, right? Both, I think, different roles, but to pose conditions in the second regard and approving them subsequently. When it comes to pooling this money of state aid rather than leaving it to the member states. And I wonder, perhaps Ramses would also have something to say about it, is that particularly also in trade law, the Commission has been, I would say, giving itself a lot more powers to influence trade. If I look at sustainability law, the Commission is also taking on a lot of legislative roles. If you look at the batteries regulation recently adopted, 25 delegated acts, so a lot of work in terms of legislative power. And so with that context in mind, with already an amped up, perhaps to use your words, Hans, fluffed up Commission in terms of lawmaking, would this be an effective way forward, right? This enforcement or enhancing that even further, or making the role for the Commission even stronger here? And then I'll let you two decide who can go first, Charlotte or Hans, or Ramses or Lea.
I could start. I think regarding consumer law breaches, I feel there are. You could decide on better coordination. I think that the revision of the regulation will also entail a new rules for coordinating efforts. But I feel in a way that as long as the Commission cannot take over when national enforcement bodies, they can only do so much within their own borders. They have to coordinate their approach, their actions. But if member states could agree on leaving some of the bigger interventions to the Commission, I really would applaud that. I think that this is really a missed opportunity, has been for a long time. Because in a way, the Commission could direct sanctions on traders, but it could also think about requesting traders to provide remedies to consumers, to also give the right example to national enforcement bodies that are maybe lagging behind a little bit. And it's it's not necessary. I think the Commission could also they could also agree at European level to leave actions to the Commission on its own initiative, or maybe preferably always in coordination with the member states. That when member states or a few of them, a majority of them agree that the Commission should take over from a point of view, for example, regarding the big platforms in Eastern Asia, that the Commission they would have the scale, I forget the gains for that type of action. And I feel that as long as it's fragmented at the national level, it's really nearly not as efficient as a Commission intervention. So yeah, I feel this really could be the way, and I really don't understand why member states are still reluctant, because yeah, I feel it could fill a gap. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Charlotte, for standing your ground, even though I nudged you in a different direction. Hans, Ramses?
Yeah,
Lea?
okay. I'd suggest an intermediary or a hybrid route, whereby part of the stuff is indeed in line with what Charlotte has already observed, simply dealt with at the EU level, but at the same time, a network of national agencies could also help, and experimentation within that network would be great fun as well. So taking it back to the competition and sustainability debate, within the European competition network, that's where the national competition authorities all cooperate together with the European Commission. I know that there are a couple of national competition authorities who have really taken the lead in specific areas. So for example, the Netherlands and Greece are really leading the debate on sustainability and competition, whereas France and Germany are focusing more on different areas, more on the verticals and how they should be dealt with under competition policy. So that would be a nice, I think, intermediary road, but at least make sure that there is cooperation so that there is a good forum for deciding on whether certain aspects are more effectively dealt with at the EU or at the national level. Yeah, so that's what I would add.
All right. An alternative to the already existing spectrum of solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at the other panelists if they would like to add something to this.
Perhaps very briefly, because you also mentioned trade as an example for this. I mean, there is a reason that trade has become an exclusive competence for the European Union, right? So we see similar things happening now with other areas becoming more and more exclusive, simply because the Union has exercised its competences much more than they did before, right? So even if the treaty still calls it a shared competence, the very fact that there is hardly anything left for the member states has turned it into a de facto exclusive competence. But the funny thing with trade is that also the concept of trade has been stretched over the years, right? So a lot more things fall under trade now. If you now look at it at an average recent trade agreement, it covers so many more things like labor standards, sustainability issues, human rights, rule of law type of issues that are all part of this whole package now. So we see this sort of incremental or sort of step-by-step functionalist, an IR person would probably say, approach that is used a lot. But it all leads to more Europe. And that is, I think, one of the things that we see behind all this report, right? There's a call for more Europe rather than less. And then again, my earlier remark on the current political climate may make that much more difficult in many of the member states.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hans, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, perhaps adding that to a nice practical example. Back in the day when the UK was still part of the gang, they wanted a whopping big subsidy for a nuclear power plant. And they said, but basically we can go this alone because the European treaty says, well, choice of energy sources, that's for the member states, energy sovereignty clause, we've called it before. And that's where the European Commission said, yeah, well, if you want to spend money on that, it's going to be state aid. And as part of the state aid, I will force you to look at alternatives for subsidizing British generation capacity. Think also about interconnection with other member states to also help stabilize your electricity system. And that's a function that the EU already has right now. And it's basically created more market integration. So definitely something that's relevant also to energy markets.
All right, thank you so much. I'm looking at the clock with my side eye. I think we're reaching the end of this this webinar, but not before I leave the panelists. I will attempt a small wrap up, but not before I give the panelists a small chance, or a short chance, I should say, to give one final thought based on these reports, should they want that.
If you insist. Well,
dangerous move, yes.
there seems to be a sort of consensus among us. If I listen to the to all four of us in reflecting on these reports, is actually the question: what do we want in the end? Right? Do we want to be more competitive and rich in the end, or become poor but living in a very sustainable society with perhaps less welfare? And that seems to be the dilemma at the moment. And where all of us seem to be, well, okay, we don't want to become like the US or China, even if Draghi and Letta force us in that direction. We have other values that we think are. But let's reconvene in 20 years and see if we still agree on that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that final remark. I'm looking around the room. Anyone that would like to add?
Thanks for organizing this.
Yes.
Not a problem.
And thanks everyone who's available online for joining.
Yeah, thanks to all the good colleagues. We saw you on the list.
Thank you for attending.
Yeah.
All right, let's come to a wrap up then. When you ask, I think, for academics to be critical, you can expect them to be critical. I've learned that. And I think also one of the things that has popped up from this discussion is also in what way are these reports discussion pieces, or are they a coherent vision for the future, right? Because in many ways they can be criticized, whether you use metaphors like an over-decorated Christmas tree or a sustainable main battle tank. They are metaphors that I think apply very nicely, because when you are critical, I think there are many aspects that you can criticize in terms of scope. It seems to, in many ways, have been a rather cherry-picking exercise of what has ended up in the report and what hasn't. And I think that requires discussion. Also, when it comes to the effectiveness of the very concrete proposals that are in there. And I think also their substantive backing sometimes, if lacking, as Hans rightly pointed out, looking for referencing there. I think we see inconsistencies in specific fields of expertise, right? We've looked at only four fields of law, but also we see those incoherencies between them, right? And then one of the major things, as Ramses rightly highlighted, has been this conflict of values between, I suppose, sustainability and competitiveness, whatever competitiveness really is in this sense, I suppose. So it's a conflict of values that I think emerges from these reports. And by going through that in an incoherent, inconsistent manner, I think this new competitiveness, whether it's new or not, we can debate in the future, but I think it will have an impact. And I think that's something that's also a clear conclusion. It will have an impact because of how concrete some of the values, some of the proposals are. We see that on a fundamental level, but also on a concrete proposal level. I think there is much to gain from it. And more on a fundamental level, I very much echo Ramses' conclusion. It's very much more Europe, more regulation, more enforcement, even though words that tend to always be a bit unreachable or ungraspable, like deregulation or cutting red tape, emerges. I think it's very much the more that I think needs to be balanced when it comes to the political reality, but also the policy reality that we're facing at the moment. I will leave it at that. I always give myself 5 minutes of overtime. We're nearly reaching that. So that leaves me to do two things. One, to greatly thank our audience for being here today. I think it was very nice to see so many of you join us today from all different fields, from academia, from policy, from industry, from representative bodies, and the list could go on. So that's been a very pleasure to have you, all of you, and also for those that engaged in the chat box, a big thank you. But of course, I've given awkward online applauses already a couple of times, but I would like to do that once more. So I very much thank Lea, Ramses, Charlotte, and Hans for their contributions today. An absolute pleasure. To the audience, as a final note, the recording will, of course, be put online, including the slides. So and look forward to discussing this a bit further in the Groningen context or in the blogs that we'll hopefully be publishing later on next year. So thank you so much, everyone, and looking forward to speaking at another time.